He is 16 years old when he enters the New York City jail system. His name is Kalief Browder. The year is 2010. The charge is robbery. The location is the Bronx. The destination is Rikers Island. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing, because what happens next reveals how this system truly works. Browder is arrested in May 2010. Police accuse him of stealing a backpack. He says he did not do it. He refuses to admit guilt. Bail is set at $3,000. His family cannot pay. He remains in custody. He is not convicted. He is not sentenced. He is detained. Rikers Island sits in the East River between Queens and the Bronx. It is one of the largest jail complexes in the United States. It holds people awaiting trial and those serving short sentences. Many detainees are legally innocent. They wait for their cases to move through the courts. Browder waits. His case is delayed again and again. Court dates come and go. Prosecutors are not ready. Witnesses do not appear. The arresting officer is unavailable. Each delay extends his confinement. Under New York law, defendants have a right to a speedy trial. In practice, delays are common. Adjournments are routine. The system moves slowly. Browder remains on Rikers Island for more than 1,000 days. Nearly 3 years. He spends approximately 2 of those years in solitary confinement. He is a teenager. He is housed in facilities that hold both adolescents and adults. During his detention, Rikers is under scrutiny for violence, staff misconduct, and excessive use of force. Federal investigations later document patterns of abuse against young detainees. Inside the jail, Browder is involved in multiple altercations. Surveillance video later released to the public shows correction officers observing as he is attacked by other detainees. In other footage, officers are seen using force against him. He maintains that he is innocent. Prosecutors reportedly offer plea deals. He refuses them. Accepting a plea would mean admitting guilt. It would likely result in time served and release. He chooses to fight the charge. The price of that choice is time. In solitary confinement, he is locked in a cell for up to 23 hours a day. The space is small. Movement is restricted. Contact is limited. Access to education and programming is minimal. Solitary confinement, also known as punitive segregation, is used for disciplinary reasons and for protective custody. Research on isolation is extensive. Studies document increased risks of anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and self-harm. Adolescents are considered particularly vulnerable. At the time of Browder's detention, the use of solitary confinement for juveniles is legal in New York City jails. He attempts suicide while in custody. Reports later confirm multiple attempts. Mental health staff intervene. He survives. His criminal case remains unresolved. Over time, prosecutors lose contact with the complaining witness. The witness does not appear in court. Without testimony, the case weakens. In 2013, the Bronx District Attorney's Office dismisses the charges. The case is dropped. Browder is released. He leaves Rikers Island without a conviction. He leaves without a criminal record for the alleged robbery. He leaves after nearly 3 years in detention. This period is the sentence no court ever formally imposes. The legal system describes pretrial detention as a temporary measure. It is meant to ensure appearance in court and protect public safety. It is not punishment. In practice, it can function as punishment, especially for those who cannot afford bail. Browder returns home to the Bronx. He is 19 years old. The years between 16 and 19 are gone. Family members later describe changes in his behavior. He struggles with depression. He experiences paranoia. He has difficulty sleeping. Loud noises trigger anxiety. He isolates himself. He attempts suicide again after release. The psychological impact does not end at the jail gate. Journalists begin to report on his case. In 2014, his story receives national attention. Video footage from Rikers circulates publicly. Civil rights advocates cite his detention as evidence of systemic failure. The narrative is not about a conviction. It is about process. It is about delay. It is about confinement without a verdict. At the time of his detention, New York City relies heavily on cash bail. Defendants who cannot afford bail remain in jail. Those with financial resources can secure release while awaiting trial. Critics argue that this system penalizes poverty. Supporters argue that bail ensures compliance with court appearances. Browder's case becomes central to that debate. His mother speaks publicly about her son's experience. Advocacy groups demand reform. Legal scholars analyze the timeline of his case. They examine the adjournments. They review court transcripts. They question why a teenager accused of a non-violent theft remains jailed for years. In 2015, Browder files a federal lawsuit against New York City, the New York City Department of Correction, and individual officers. The suit alleges malicious prosecution, violation of civil rights, and abuse while detained. Before the lawsuit is resolved, Browder dies. In June 2015, at the age of 22, he dies by suicide at his home in the Bronx. His death intensifies public scrutiny. National media outlets cover the story. Political leaders respond. The case becomes a reference point in discussions about bail reform and solitary confinement. President Barack Obama later cites Browder's experience when announcing federal limits on solitary confinement for juveniles in federal facilities. Although Browder is held in a city jail, his story resonates beyond New York. In New York City, officials announce changes. In 2015, the city ends the use of punitive solitary confinement for detainees aged 16 and 17. Later reforms raise the age and further restrict isolation practices. The city also implements changes to bail policies and court procedures. These reforms do not erase the years Browder spends detained. The part of the sentence no one talks about is not written in a judgment. It does not appear in sentencing minutes. It is the time between accusation and resolution. It is the uncertainty. It is the waiting. It is the isolation. Pretrial detention affects hundreds of thousands of people each year in the United States. Many are not convicted of the charges that bring them to jail. Some have cases dismissed. Some are acquitted. Some plead guilty to secure release. The system distinguishes between jail and prison. Jail holds the accused. Prison holds the convicted. For the individual, the distinction can blur. At Rikers Island during Browder's detention, reports from the U.S. Department of Justice describe a culture of violence. In 2014, the department concludes that adolescent males are subjected to excessive force by correction officers. The findings point to systemic problems. Browder's experience fits within that broader context. His time in solitary confinement totals approximately 700 days. For comparison, international human rights organizations often define prolonged solitary confinement as more than 15 consecutive days. Critics argue that extended isolation constitutes cruel treatment. U.S. courts have historically granted correctional facilities broad discretion. In interviews conducted before his death, Browder speaks about the psychological toll. He describes feeling hopeless. He describes thinking about suicide while in isolation. He states that he refuses plea deals because he does not want to admit to something he says he did not do. The case raises questions about plea bargaining. In the United States, the vast majority of criminal cases end in guilty pleas. Trials are rare. Defendants often weigh the risk of longer sentences against the certainty of shorter ones. For those in custody, the pressure can intensify. Browder chooses to wait for trial. The trial never happens. His detention underscores the consequences of delay. Court backlogs are common in large jurisdictions. Prosecutors manage heavy caseloads. Public defenders do the same. Adjournments accumulate. Each postponement extends confinement for those who cannot post bail. The Constitution guarantees due process. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy trial. The interpretation of speedy varies. Courts evaluate factors such as length of delay, reason for delay, and prejudice to the defendant. In Browder's case, the delay reaches nearly 3 years. When the charges are dismissed, there is no formal apology. There is no conviction to overturn. There is no sentence to vacate. There is only release. After his death, his family continues the lawsuit. In 2019, New York City agrees to a settlement reportedly worth several $1 million. The settlement does not include an admission of wrongdoing. Financial compensation does not measure psychological damage. Browder's name becomes associated with reform legislation. In New York State, lawmakers passed changes to bail laws in 2019, eliminating cash bail for many nonviolent offenses. Supporters cite cases like his as evidence that detention should not hinge on income. Critics argue that changes may affect public safety. The debate continues. Rikers Island itself becomes a symbol. Plans are announced to close the complex and replace it with smaller borough-based facilities. Implementation moves slowly. The jail remains open. The part of the sentence no one talks about is not only time served. It is the impact that continues after release. Former detainees report difficulty finding employment. They report stigma. They report trauma. Even without a conviction, the experience shapes their lives. Browder's story is documented in court records, investigative reports, and interviews. The facts are clear. Arrest at 16. Bail set at $3,000. Nearly 3 years detained. Approximately 2 years in solitary confinement. Charges dismissed. Death by suicide at 22. There is no dramatic twist. There is no courtroom verdict. There is process. The American justice system relies on the presumption of innocence. In practice, detention before trial can resemble punishment. The gap between principle and experience defines this case. Browder enters Rikers as a teenager accused of stealing a backpack. He leaves as a young man carrying the psychological weight of prolonged isolation. The formal record shows no conviction. The informal consequences are harder to quantify. After his release in 2013, Kalief Browder attempts to resume a life interrupted by detention. He returns to the Bronx. He enrolls in school. He tries to reconnect with friends and family. The formal case against him is over. The psychological impact is not. He reports ongoing depression. He describes paranoia and anxiety. Family members observe mood changes. He struggles with sleep. He reacts strongly to sudden noises. He spends long periods alone. Mental health professionals recognize patterns consistent with trauma exposure. Extended isolation is associated with lasting psychological effects. Browder's confinement includes approximately 700 days in solitary housing. Research published in peer-reviewed journals links prolonged solitary confinement to increased risk of self-harm and suicide attempts. Adolescents are considered especially vulnerable because neurological development is ongoing. While detained at Rikers Island, Browder attempts suicide multiple times. After release, the attempts continue. Emergency responders intervene on at least one occasion. He survives those incidents. His story gains national attention in 2014 and 2015. Investigative reports document the timeline of his detention. Court records confirm repeated adjournments. Prosecutors state that delays stem in part from difficulty securing the complaining witness. Without that witness, the case weakens. In 2013, the Bronx District Attorney's Office dismisses the charges. Media coverage expands after surveillance video emerges showing Browder involved in altercations on Rikers Island. The footage becomes central to public discussion about jail conditions. Advocacy groups cite the video as evidence of systemic problems within the New York City Department of Correction. Civil rights organizations analyze the broader context. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice releases findings concluding that adolescent males at Rikers are subjected to excessive and unnecessary force. The report documents a pattern of violence and inadequate supervision. Browder's detention overlaps with the period examined in that investigation. His case becomes a reference point in debates about bail reform. At the time of his arrest, New York relies heavily on cash bail. Judges set bail amounts based on statutory factors. For many defendants, even relatively low bail proves unaffordable. Browder's bail is set at $3,000. His family cannot pay. He remains incarcerated. Data from the period show that a large percentage of detainees on Rikers Island are pretrial. Many face non-violent charges. Studies indicate that defendants held pretrial are more likely to plead guilty, even when evidence is weak, in order to secure release or reduce exposure to longer sentences. Browder rejects plea offers. He maintains his innocence. Legal scholars review the constitutional framework. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy trial. Courts apply a balancing test established by the U.S. Supreme Court in Barker v. Wingo. The test considers the length of delay, the reason for delay, the defendant's assertion of the right, and prejudice resulting from delay. Application varies case by case. Browder's nearly 3-year detention without trial raises questions about how those factors operate in practice. His experience also draws attention to the use of solitary confinement for juveniles. At the time of his incarceration, New York City policy permits punitive segregation for 16- and 17-year-olds housed in adult jails. Mental health experts warn that isolation can exacerbate psychiatric symptoms. International human rights bodies criticize prolonged solitary confinement, especially for minors. In early 2015, Browder files a federal civil rights lawsuit against New York City, the Department of Correction, and individual officers. The complaint alleges malicious prosecution and unconstitutional conditions of confinement. The litigation seeks monetary damages. The case is pending when his life ends. On June 6, 2015, Browder dies by suicide at his home in the Bronx. He is 22 years old. His death intensifies public scrutiny. National news outlets revisit the timeline of his detention. Lawmakers reference his case in speeches and hearings. Advocacy organizations call for structural reform. His mother speaks publicly about the toll of prolonged detention. President Barack Obama later cites Browder's experience when announcing federal reforms limiting the use of solitary confinement for juveniles in federal facilities. Although Rikers Island is a city jail, not a federal prison, the case resonates at the national level. In New York City, policy changes begin. In 2015, city officials announced the end of punitive solitary confinement for 16- and 17-year-olds. Subsequent reforms expand restrictions on isolation for young adults. The Department of Correction revises disciplinary practices. Oversight mechanisms increase. Independent monitors track compliance. Debate continues regarding the effectiveness of these measures. Some critics argue that alternative housing units still impose significant restrictions. Others contend that meaningful reductions in isolation represent progress. Data collection improves, but disputes remain about conditions inside the facilities. Bail reform becomes a legislative priority in New York State. In 2019, lawmakers enact sweeping changes eliminating cash bail for most misdemeanor and non-violent felony charges. The reforms aim to reduce pretrial detention and address disparities linked to income. Supporters cite Browder's case as evidence that pretrial detention can cause irreversible harm. Opponents express concern about public safety and judicial discretion. Subsequent amendments modify aspects of the law. The debate remains active. Rikers Island itself faces structural scrutiny. Plans are announced to close the jail complex and replace it with smaller borough-based facilities. The proposal moves through environmental review and budget processes. Timelines extend into future years. Meanwhile, reports continue to document violence, staffing shortages, and detainee deaths within the existing complex. Browder's family pursues the civil lawsuit after his death. In 2019, New York City agrees to a settlement reportedly valued at approximately $3 million. The settlement resolves the claims without an admission of liability. Monetary compensation addresses legal claims. It does not address psychological injury or loss of life. Academic researchers incorporate Browder's case into broader studies of pretrial detention. Empirical data show that even short periods of jail detention can increase the likelihood of future contact with the criminal justice system. Extended detention amplifies those risks. The mechanisms include disruption of education, employment, housing stability, and social networks. Browder's nearly 3 years in custody occur during critical developmental years. Public defenders and prosecutors respond differently to reform proposals. Some prosecutors support alternatives to cash bail combined with risk assessment tools. Civil liberties groups question algorithmic risk assessments, arguing that they may replicate racial or socio-economic disparities embedded in historical data. Browder's case becomes a focal point for examining how discretion, delay, and detention intersect. Mental health advocates emphasize the connection between incarceration and suicide risk. National statistics show elevated suicide rates among individuals with recent jail detention. Solitary confinement is associated with significantly higher rates of self-harm compared to general population housing. Browder's history includes multiple suicide attempts while incarcerated and after release. His death underscores the long-term effects that may persist beyond confinement. The phrase "innocent until proven guilty" appears frequently in public commentary. In practice, detention prior to conviction can impose consequences similar to punishment. Employment opportunities disappear. Educational trajectories stall. Family relationships strain. Even when charges are dismissed, the record of arrest remains visible in background checks unless sealed or expunged. Browder's charges are dismissed. He does not receive a conviction. Yet his detention shapes national policy discussions. Law schools analyze the procedural timeline. Journalists reconstruct each adjournment. Advocates use his name when arguing for systemic change. The broader issue extends beyond a single case. Across the United States, hundreds of thousands of people remain in jail awaiting trial on any given day. Many are detained because they cannot afford bail amounts that range from a few hundred to several $1,000s. Some are acquitted. Some have charges dismissed. The period of detention, regardless of outcome, can alter life trajectories. Rikers Island remains operational. Oversight reports continue to document challenges, including violence among detainees and between detainees and staff. Federal monitors assess compliance with consent decrees. Political leaders debate whether closure is feasible within projected timelines. The part of the sentence no one talks about is not a statutory maximum. It is not written in penal code. It exists in the gap between accusation and resolution. It exists in the cumulative effect of adjournments, housing assignments, and isolation orders. It exists in the psychological aftermath that continues after release. Kalief Browder's name becomes shorthand for that gap. His story does not end with a verdict. It ends with reform efforts still in progress and a life that does not recover from prolonged detention. The national response to Kalief Browder's case moves beyond New York City. Lawmakers, researchers, and advocacy groups examine the structure of pretrial detention across the United States. The focus shifts from one jail complex to a nationwide system. On any given day in the United States, hundreds of thousands of people sit in local jails awaiting trial. Most have not been convicted. Many are charged with non-violent offenses. A significant percentage remain detained because they cannot afford bail. Cash bail is designed to ensure a defendant's return to court. Judges consider statutory factors such as flight risk and community safety. In practice, the ability to pay often determines release. Those with financial resources can secure freedom within hours. Those without may remain incarcerated for weeks, months, or years. Browder's bail is set at $3,000. The amount is not extraordinary by national standards. For his family, it is unaffordable. That single decision shapes the next 3 years of his life. Researchers begin to quantify the impact of pretrial detention. Studies conducted by academic institutions and policy organizations find that even short jail stays can increase the likelihood of conviction, primarily through guilty pleas. Defendants detained pretrial are statistically more likely to accept plea deals, often to secure release. The pressure intensifies as days in custody accumulate. Browder refuses plea offers. He maintains that he did not commit the robbery. He chooses to wait for trial. The trial never occurs. Legal analysts revisit the concept of a speedy trial. In Barker v. Wingo, the U.S. Supreme Court establishes a 4-factor balancing test. Courts evaluate the length of delay, the reason for delay, whether the defendant asserts the right, and whether the delay causes prejudice. The standard is flexible. It requires case-by-case analysis. In Browder's case, the delays stem from repeated adjournments. Prosecutors cite the unavailability of the complaining witness and other procedural issues. Defense attorneys request time at certain stages. The court calendar contributes to postponements. The cumulative effect is nearly 3 years in detention. The constitutional right remains intact in theory. In practice, enforcement is uneven. The discussion also centers on adolescent detention in adult facilities. At the time of Browder's incarceration, 16 and 17-year-olds in New York are automatically treated as adults in the criminal justice system. They are housed on Rikers Island, though in designated units. Later reforms known as Raise the Age shift most 16 and 17-year-olds into the juvenile system. Browder's case becomes part of the context for those legislative changes. Solitary confinement receives particular scrutiny. Medical associations and mental health experts submit testimony to legislative bodies. They describe the neurological vulnerability of adolescents. They cite research linking prolonged isolation to anxiety disorders, depression, cognitive impairment, and increased suicide risk. Browder's approximately 700 days in isolation are frequently referenced in hearings and public statements. New York City announces policy changes restricting punitive segregation for younger detainees. Data tracking improves. Oversight bodies monitor implementation. Critics argue that some restrictive housing units still resemble solitary confinement in practice. City officials assert that reforms reduce harm while maintaining order. At the federal level, the Department of Justice issues guidance limiting the use of solitary confinement for juveniles in federal facilities. President Barack Obama references Browder's experience during public remarks. Although federal facilities represent a small portion of total detention nationwide, the policy shift signals recognition of broader concerns. Civil litigation proceeds after Browder's death. His estate continues the lawsuit filed before he died. In 2019, New York City agrees to a settlement reported at approximately $3 million. The agreement resolves claims against the city and individual officers without admission of liability. The settlement closes the civil case. It does not close the policy debate. Advocates use Browder's name in campaigns for bail reform. In 2019, New York State eliminates cash bail for most misdemeanor and non-violent felony charges. Judges retain discretion for more serious offenses. The reforms aim to reduce the jail population and address disparities linked to income. Implementation generates political controversy. Critics argue that the changes may endanger public safety. Supporters contend that pretrial liberty should not depend on wealth. Subsequent amendments modify elements of the reform law. Lawmakers adjust judicial discretion and expand the list of bail-eligible offenses. The legislative process reflects ongoing tension between public safety concerns and civil liberties. Nationally, other states examine their bail systems. Some expand pretrial services and supervised release programs. Others adopt or revise risk assessment tools designed to estimate likelihood of court appearance and rearrest. Critics question whether such tools may replicate racial bias embedded in historical arrest data. Browder's case remains part of the national conversation, illustrating the human cost of prolonged detention. Academic research continues to document the long-term effects of incarceration, even without conviction. Studies indicate that pretrial detention correlates with job loss, housing instability, and disruption of education. Adolescents face particular risk because incarceration interrupts critical developmental milestones. Browder enters detention at 16. He spends formative years in a jail environment characterized by violence and isolation. Mental health data underscore the severity of confinement conditions. Suicide rates in local jails consistently exceed those in the general population. Isolation units report higher rates of self-harm than general housing units. Browder's documented suicide attempts while detained align with those findings. After release, his mental health challenges persist. Media coverage expands beyond print journalism. Documentary series and investigative programs recount the timeline of Browder's detention. Interviews with family members, attorneys, and public officials reinforce the factual sequence: arrest, unaffordable bail, repeated adjournments, solitary confinement, dismissal of charges, release, and death by suicide. The narrative shifts from a single individual to structural examination. Observers ask how many others experience prolonged detention without conviction but do not receive national attention. Data from local jurisdictions suggest that Browder's case, while extreme in duration, reflects broader systemic patterns.